Hello and welcome to another timely conversation about Turkish politics. My name is Sinan Ciddi. I'm a non-resident fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies in Washington, D.C., and an associate professor of security studies at the Marine Corps University. Today, we're going to speak about Turkey's ruling party, the AKP, which stands for the Justice and Development Party. Last week, the AKP celebrated its 23rd anniversary since its founding in 2001. It came to power as a party in 2002 and has governed Turkey under the leadership of Recep Tayyip Erdogan in his capacity either as prime minister and since 2014 as Turkey's president. Regardless of one's personal views on the accomplishments and failings of the AKP and Erdogan, we can all agree that Turkey has been transformed politically, economically, and socially after 22 years. How that transformation is evaluated is a different matter, however. In the early years, we saw the country record levels of economic expansion and rising of individual incomes. More recently, we are witnessing the worst levels of economic decline and societal misery that comes with triple-digit inflation in the history of the Turkish Republic. Turkey is also identified by scholars and analysts alike as a poster child for democratic backsliding, with heavy declines in the rule of law. Recent opinion polls suggest that Erdogan-led AKP government is monumentally unpopular, even though Erdogan could remain in office technically until 2028. So what should we make of 22 years of Erdogan-led AKP rule in Turkey? Well, to help us put all this into context, I am joined by my good colleague and friend, Dr. Berk Esen, who's an associate professor of political science at Sabancı University in Istanbul. He is the leading scholar of democratic backsliding in Turkey and has published a whole litany of scholarly articles and books on the subject. Additionally, he's a frequent guest on numerous international and domestic news channels and author of countless analysis pieces on Turkey's political trajectory. In addition to following his written work, you can also follow Dr. Esen on X, where he provides timely insights under his handle @BerkEsen. Berk, welcome to the show, and thanks for making time for us today.
Thanks for having me, Sinan.
Okay, so let's get to the meat of this. So after 23 years is not that long for a time for a party to be in existence, but 22 years in power is a very long time for a party to remain in power, especially a democracy. There is an entire generation of Turks who do not know any other government other than what they have seen under Erdogan. In your estimation, what is the single biggest legacy of the AKP and Erdogan's time in power?
Well, after 23 years in power, it's difficult to pick one single issue because at the moment, I think Turkey's track record is quite dismal on many issues, ranging from a very ineffective foreign policy, especially since the Arab Spring, to stagflation, a dismal record on education, erosion of state institutions, lack of rule of law, nepotism, increased polarization, and partisanship. So I think on various issues, at the moment, AKP government's track record is quite poor. But I can maybe suggest two particular legacies where this poor track record really comes to the forefront. Well, first is, not surprisingly, the state of Turkish democracy. So Turkish politics has oscillated for about maybe 75 years, basically, since the first transition to democratic rule, between right-wing majoritarian rule and military tutelage or military rule. So some kind of a balance over time prevented Turkish politics from experiencing durable authoritarian rule. So we had authoritarian leadership, sometimes under civilian governments and sometimes under military governments. But on neither of those occasions, that authoritarian leadership proved to be durable. In other words, it did not necessarily continue for more than a few years. Now, Erdogan's AKP, as you alluded to in your question, when it first came to power, eroded the military's autonomy and basically ended the military's huge influence over Turkish politics. But the problem is, rather than pushing for democratization, the ruling party asserted its own partisan control, such that probably sometime by 2015, 2016, Turkish democracy collapsed. And that we now have close to a decade-long authoritarian rule under a civilian leadership, during which time basically bureaucratic institutions are almost completely captured. And I think it's going to be a long time before this is fixed. And this is really a terrible legacy for Erdogan to run on. And I consider Erdogan, together with Modi and Orban, as the foremost populist autocrat of this current age. Now, if I have to pick one issue in terms of the AKP's legacy, and this is probably irreversible, I would suggest Turkey's changed demography. So, due to Erdogan's dismal foreign policy, Turkey currently faces a massive migration crisis. Over 4 million Syrians have migrated to Turkey and are currently living in Turkey. And of course, this number is still counting. The ongoing open door policy brought hundreds of thousands of people from various parts of Middle East, Africa, Pakistan, Afghanistan. And I think the AKP government encourages this through visa-free agreements to recruit cheap labor. And on top of that, the government enacts flexible citizenship laws. So we have a growing migrant population currently living in Turkey. Now, this is juxtaposed to falling birth rates within Turkey, because, of course, due to rising living costs, education costs, Turkish citizens are no longer willing to bear children. So the two combined is going to leave a very changed demographic situation compared to when AKP first came to power, when Turkey had a booming population, fairly young population. And after 23 years in power, Erdogan's legacy is an aging, increasingly diverse, but low-income, low-educated population.
Yeah, I mean, so much to pick up on there. And, one thing that struck me is obviously, I think there's a whole series of missed opportunities that they initially thought they could capitalize upon from Turkey inside of Europe, Turkey in the future as a regional actor. But it also, as you suggest, there's a lot of sort of issues that you could pick up. But I think, yes, the demographic issue is somewhat understated in the official sort of dialogue or the discourse about Turkey. But you're right. I think it's going to have a resounding impact on the future of how the population shapes up. So you have written extensively about the relationship between Turkey's democratic decline and its direct link with the AKP. So we went from defining Turkey as a flawed democracy to competitive authoritarianism. And in one of your recent outlets now, it's basically straight up authoritarian. And if we were to accept Freedom House's classification of Turkey, then it's a country that is basically what they say is not free. So what are the obstacles and opportunities, do you think, for Turkey to one day again be described as a democratic state?
Well, of course, the main obstacle is that we have a ruling party, that is AKP, Justice and Development Party, which during its 23 years in office captured every state institution that one can think of. All upper branches of bureaucracy, probably its lower ranks as well, much of the judiciary, much of the security forces, including not just the police forces, but also the military as well. Which means that if the AKP government is removed from power at some point, many of these people are going to lose their jobs. And I think the same goes for many academics employed at state institutions, state universities, especially those who currently hold ministerial positions. Many of the politically connected firms that are currently getting legal tenders from the government will start losing them. And so that kind of a partisanship created, I think, very strong ties of dependency, which the ruling party can use and has continued to use to mobilize support, especially during elections. And so that's why there is an uneven playing field tilted against the opposition. That makes it very difficult for opposition parties to defeat AKP through the ballot box, which is why Turkey has become more and more authoritarian. So when you have such a entrenched one-party rule, it's really difficult to attain government turnover through democratic means. And of course, this party is led by a charismatic leader. a right-wing populist leader who also happens to be quite able as a politician, a very shrewd operator, and he's election obsessed. Such a leader is actually quite difficult to defeat. So, this term right-wing populist is used for a number of leaders around the globe. But I think our listeners should not think of figures like Bolsonaro, Boris Johnson, or Donald Trump, who are effective communicators and have won elections, but do not necessarily lead very strong parties. They are not shrewd operators, and they could not necessarily transform the state apparatus. Erdogan is more in the league of Modi, who currently is transforming Indian politics after decades of Congress party rule, or Viktor Orban, who had an even longer run, or close to Erdogan's period in power. Now, if one wants to go beyond AKP in terms of thinking of factors that has weakened Turkish democracy, of course, culture wars between seculars and conservatives, and the existence of a Kurdish minority that has been systematically excluded. Of course, these two issues have, over the decades, really weakened Turkish democracy and sometimes led to its breakdown. But I would just say that in terms of the main obstacle, it's more AKP. Now, on the optimistic side, because I'm still hopeful that at some point this situation can be reversed. I mean, I feel that Turkey still has a lot of opportunities for democratization. Well, first of all, its strong electoral tradition that goes back decades. People do care for the electoral process. They do go out to vote. The turnout rate is around 85% in the Turkish case, one of the highest around the globe. Opposition parties have, despite this autocratization process, remained intact, especially the main opposition party. One can have all sorts of criticisms leveled against the main opposition party, but this party can still draw electoral support, and it currently controls most of the major provinces at the local level since 2019. I think this should give us some hope that things can change, especially considering the fact that Erdogan is currently an aging leader, increasingly out of touch with increasingly urban youth of Turkey, and AKP's party capacity is significantly diminished due to Erdogan's top-down rule. When you add to these factors the current economic downturn, I think the opposition has strong chances of changing this government through the ballot box.
Yeah, and no doubt, and also I would, if I was to add to that, I would just say, without Erdogan, the AKP is likely to be another party in Turkey's long history of political parties that's likely to sort of fizzle out and disappear from the landscape. And it would obviously clear the field to allow another sort of political agent, such as the main opposition party, obviously to essentially to see if it can re-engage in what I would call reinstitutionalizing the government and the state space, such that voter preferences and citizen preferences can be translated into possibly maybe a new social contract, which is sorely needed. But since you mentioned the opposition, and that's the final question I would say as well, it's clear that as much as the AKP and Erdogan's governance is basically attributed to Turkey's shift toward an authoritarian state, which is justified given how long they've been in power, we cannot ignore the role that opposition political parties have also played in this sort of scenario. So in your estimation, to what extent do you think are parties like the main opposition, CHP, responsible for where Turkey is today, politically speaking?
I think this is a very important question because you're right. It's difficult to attribute 23 years of uninterrupted AKP rule to its own success. Of course, that played an important role, especially during its first decade in power. But I think CHP also played a role in bringing about this outcome. Now, I can think of two specific ways through which CHP contributed to AKP's prolonged success over the last 23 years. Well, first of all, during the AKP's first two terms in power, when actually the ruling party, you could argue, acted in a democratizing manner for strategic reasons, basically to circumvent Turkey's powerful military and judiciary. Unfortunately, the CHP chose to act in concert with these unpopular institutions. You have written extensively on this period and worked on the CHP of 2000s. Unfortunately, throughout that decade, the CHP, in opposition to the AKP government, did not call for more democratization, but rather sought to preserve the status quo, however impaired, however unsatisfactory that was. And it chose to push for a rather obstructionist opposition strategy. So it tried to prevent the AKP from exercising its policies by taking legislations that have been enacted by the parliament to the constitutional court and having them ruled out. It gave the military legitimacy and popular justification to intervene in the democratic process and challenge the AKP government. I think those obstructionist measures or strategies gave the ruling party the justification to go against legitimate opposition groups, undermine their base of support, and capture the judiciary. And while doing so, the AKP actually received support from Western governments, because many Western governments thought that the CHP would have been a much worse political alternative, and that CHP was siding with what was increasingly unpopular and undemocratic judicial institutions. Now, what they failed to see was that Erdogan's ultimate goal at the end of the day was not to democratize the judiciary, but rather to capture it for its own political agenda. But because the CHP did not offer an alternative, that was really lost. And AKP ended up being unchecked, really, until the 2013 Gezi Park protests. Until that time, the Western media, as well as Western governments and stakeholders, were very supportive of the AKP government. And I think the CHP's obstructionist strategy until that time played a role. The other way that one can criticize CHP and consider it to have contributed to AKP's dominance was its weak organizational capacity. So the CHP failed to increase its popular appeal and did not really invest in its organizational networks across the country. Its electoral base was confined to upper middle class neighborhoods, especially in coastal areas of Turkey and the major cities. The rest of the country was almost left unchecked to the AKP, and the CHP leadership, both under Deniz Baykal and to a certain extent under Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, did not necessarily try to change that. As a result of this this phenomena, CHP could not offer a credible alternative to the AKP government, both in terms of actual political cadres, but also in terms of its programmatic appeal. So the CHP, when it stopped siding with the military or the judiciary, and I would say that this began under Kılıçdaroğlu's leadership, so in the 2010s, it still focused excessively on criticizing what AKP was doing rather than offering a credible programmatic alternative. And I think that really hurt the party over time. Now, this has begun to change lately. CHP, especially at the local level, started recruiting better candidates who can win. And indeed, we have seen both in the 2019, but more importantly, in 2024 local elections, CHP candidates defeating the incumbents. And this has allowed CHP mayors to gain invaluable government experience, as well as train some cadres who can at some point come to power at the national level. And we now have a revitalized new young leadership at the helm of the party. Özgür Özel, the current CHP chairman, replaced Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, who under his 13 years in office became probably one of the most formidable perennial losers of Turkish politics, having led his party to a series of election defeats. This has begun to change, and it's no surprise that CHP is rising in the polls, became the largest party in the recent 2024 local elections, and is currently actually governing much of the country at the city level. I think this should give Turkey observers some hope that things can change and that Turkey can once again begin to democratize through the ballot box.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is equal sort of ample room for cautious optimism going forward. The one thing I would add as we end this, I would just suggest that one of the things that is probably incumbent upon the CHP leadership is to obviously approach this from a programmatic view, because at the level of the average voter in Turkey, I think there's this longing for some sort of savior to take Turkey out of its economic, political, and social malaise, with all the sort of problems that you mentioned. And the best way to address that from a responsible party actor would be to say, yes, we have charismatic and electable leaders who can win, but what's the essential platform that's going to, what's their governance platform beyond personalities, which would be ideal and helpful. But we've seemingly accomplished an unaccomplishable task in this short amount of time, which is evaluate the last 23 years of the AKP in under 3 questions. And I think you've done an admirable job. So what we'll do is say thanks to you for taking time to talk to us today. And hopefully when we have another interesting development coming up, we'd love to have you back on. And it'd be wonderful to host you again. So thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me anytime.
Thank you.